We want to show what becomes possible for a person, for a family, for a culture when we begin to prioritize and understand the very beginning of life.
Beautifully said, Ashley. I am so grateful that we're doing this. I am so grateful to be able to share our stories, and I cannot wait for the amazing conversations that we're going to have.
Welcome to the APPPAH Podcast, Demystifying Birth Psychology, where we explore the invisible architecture of the human experience, how our earliest environments shape our nervous systems, our identities, and the relationships we build. Because when we bring awareness to the beginning, we don't just gain insight, we begin to shift the very foundations of the cultural fabric of our world.
Join us as we bring forward conversations with thought leaders whose work lives at the intersection of science, lived experience, and the human condition. This podcast will be grounded in the work of APPPAH, the Association for Prenatal and Perinatal Psychology and Health, an organization with over 40 years of research, education, and advocacy, exploring how life before and around birth shapes who we become. Together, we'll explore how these earliest experiences continue to influence the way we live, connect, and relate.
Birth psychology, or prenatal and perinatal psychology, is essentially the study of early human and nervous system development. It's an interdisciplinary study pulling together research in neuroscience, epigenetics, attachment, and affect regulation. Wendy, I've always considered you to be APPA's best staff historian, and I think that we should start by sharing a little bit about APPA's history and where we come from.
I totally agree. I am always happy to be the resident historian on staff. I know that we're going to share an interview with APPA's founder, but I'm happy to give a little background of APPAH, which has been an organization for 44 years. In 1982, when Dr. Thomas Verney, our founder, published his first book, The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, the response to this book was incredible. It was radical. It was all the things that you probably want when you're publishing a book. Prenatal and perinatal professionals from around the world read his book and connected with it, and his book went viral. He was touring in California to promote his book, and Dr. Verney met Dr. David Chamberlain, and the two of them were inspired to create a conference together where professionals could come together and talk about all of these different things that everyone was learning. And that conference led to the founding of the Prenatal and Perinatal Psychology Association of America, which was eventually renamed APPAH, the Association for Prenatal and Perinatal Psychology and Health. Today, as we fast forward, the organization is backed by JOPA, our academic journal, and has nearly 100 years of research in this field. And 4 decades later, the same spirit of connection and curiosity is what drives everything that we do at APPAH, which is partially what brought me to this organization. And Ashley, I know I've told you this story before, but I'm so excited to share it on this platform. I grew up in a really birth positive household. My parents were really openly sharing about my birth story, about my siblings' birth stories. It was never something that was hidden and squirreled away. And I just thought that was really normal. When I went on to study anthropology at UC Santa Cruz, I had a huge focus on motherhood and women's studies. It was something that I was just forever always passionate about. And around that same time, my sister-in-law had her first baby in our family, and I got to be there for the birth. But I think what was really so much more impactful was being able to listen to my mom and my sister-in-law talk about so much around birth along the way. And they talked about so many pieces that were incredibly integral and centric in birth psychology. And that just spurred what I thought was a passion project. At the time, I was attending births for my other friends and for family members. After college, I worked for a nonprofit where I was learning about establishing and building community. And in 2021, I found myself in the middle of a career shift. I was building up my doula business, and I happened to find APPAH at the time. And their principles resonated within everything within me. I was obsessed. I was trying to learn everything I could from their website. And serendipitously, I applied for a position with our org around that same time. And nearly 5 years later, I'm still here and I'm building the same kinds of connections and curiosity that brought me here in the first place.
Wendy, I came to birth psychology in a completely different way than you, which is why I just love this subject so much because it applies to anyone who has ever been born. And I think it's so much fun getting to know people through APPA and seeing how they come to birth psychology and how they find this and apply it to their own experiences. But for me, my experience began with the birth of my daughter. And that was about 9 years after a pretty traumatic loss experience. And I had done all the things, I had checked all the boxes, I had gone to therapy. And I remember moving through my prenatal experience, doing everything differently than I had done before. I was choosing midwifery care, out of hospital birth. I was checking all of those boxes and doing all of the things that I thought I was supposed to be doing. And I remember feeling a lot of anxiety about my own experience and being shocked that everything that I had thought I had worked through came flying up at me in my pregnancy experience. And I felt the need to hide it. I was feeling very alone in that experience. And it was at that time, we weren't really talking about pregnancy after loss. And I remember feeling really alone in that process. So after taking the childbirth classes and reading the books and doing all of the prenatal preparation, I remember moving through childbirth and being completely shocked by the experience. It was the most transformative experience of my life. It was magical in all the ways, but the rug pulled out from underneath me. My hypnobabies went out the window. It was way more intense than I could have ever imagined, and it completely reshaped who I am as a human being. And I remember coming out of that and coming into my postpartum experience where I had only been given some base level information. I remember that a few people had given me the vague, the first few weeks are the trenches, here are some healing supplies. And I came out of birth a completely different person. Matrescence is no joke. I like to equate it to Kafka's Metamorphosis, right? I woke up and I felt like a bug. My hair was a different color. I didn't recognize myself emotionally. I'm like, what is this process that I'm moving through? And at that point, I knew that there was something that I had not been shared with, something that had not been shared with me during my own experience that I felt like every woman needed to know. This is a universal process. And why aren't we talking about the psychological shifts that happen during this process? So I spent my first 2 years of postpartum reading every book that I could find on the psychology surrounding this experience and matrescence and what these processes are. And eventually my husband looked at me and was like, hey, look at your bookshelf. You should probably do something with that. And that's when I decided to become a doula. And I dove into doula work. I was doing much deeper work than most doulas in my community. I had come from the spa industry. I'd spent a decade working in the spa industry. So I wanted to offer a greater level of depth and care for my clients. And I was looking for some kind of a community component where I could bring some education to our community that I had not received surrounding the psychology of birth. And I looked everywhere. I did so much research for about 6 months trying to find a childbirth education program that really integrated these principles, and I couldn't find anything. So eventually I just threw my hands up and I said, you know what? I'm just going to have to take the books that I have and build something for myself. And it was right around that time that APPA just magically fell into my lap. And I was like, oh my gosh, they have a prenatal and perinatal educator program. I'm a serious nerd, and it went as deep as I was looking to go. It was a 185-hour program. It took me about a year and a half to complete. And I went into that thinking, I'm going to learn information and disseminate it within my community. And ultimately, it completely changed my life. I never anticipated that it would change the way that I talk to myself, the way that I parent my daughter, the way that I connected with my clients. And as I started integrating these concepts into my work as a doula, as a non-clinical professional, I started noticing that my client outcomes were shifting dramatically. And I was like, what is happening? This is relational care, and it's making dramatic shifts in these people's experiences. It's changing the way that they move into parenthood. It's changing the start of this process for them in the beginning of their baby's lives. And that was when I knew I needed to get more involved with APPA. I dove in, started doing more volunteer work with APPA, and I was eventually invited to be on the board where I started working more with Wendy, and we just fell in love with each other. And then eventually I was invited to be the secretary of the board, and then eventually the executive director, where Wendy and I were really able to work with the board and dive into our shared vision. I think part of what has been so interesting to me after coming to APPA was that APPA wasn't something that was easy for me to find. And I've noticed that a lot of people find APPA in the same way that I did, where APPA just appears at the right moment, which is great. But I think that the subject is so important and so impactful, and I want it to be more accessible to people around the world. And right now, we are at a place of technological expansion. And Wendy and I had this beautiful shared vision for really expanding APPA's reach technologically and through accessible options like this podcast, especially for birth professionals, because this is really deeply inspired by our own backgrounds. And it keeps bringing me back to a quote that I came across while in the prenatal and perinatal educator program, the PP&E program, by Michel Odant. And he was talking about how the fastest way to societal change is through grassroots education and support. And that's really what we're trying to do here with this podcast. We want to show what becomes possible for a person, for a family, for a culture when we begin to prioritize and understand the very beginning of life.
Beautifully said, Ashley. I am so grateful that we're doing this. I am so grateful to be able to share our stories, and I cannot wait for the amazing conversations that we're going to have. As we begin to close this first episode, we want to thank you for being here with us at the very beginning of this conversation, because that's really what this podcast is about, beginning again. Looking back at the earliest chapters of the human experience with more curiosity, more compassion, and more willingness to understand what has shaped us.
Because birth psychology isn't just about pregnancy or birth. It's about the foundations of who we become, how we learn safety, connection, belonging, resilience, protection, love, and relationship. And when we begin to understand the beginning, something really powerful opens up. We start to see ourselves differently. We start to see babies differently. And we start to see families, birth, care, culture, and even healing differently.
For over 40 years, APPA has been helping bring this awareness forward through research, education, advocacy, and community. And this podcast is one more way that we're making these conversations more accessible.
So whether you're a parent, a birth professional, a therapist, a body worker, an educator, a healthcare provider, or simply someone who is curious about what shapes the human experience, we're so glad you're here. This is just the beginning.
In the episodes ahead, we'll bring you conversations with researchers, practitioners, elders, educators, and thought leaders whose work helps us understand how life before and around birth continues to influence the way we live, connect, parent, heal, and belong.
You can learn more about APPA, explore our courses, our events, and connect with our global community through the links in the show notes. And if this conversation resonated with you, we hope you'll subscribe, share this podcast with someone who would love this work, and stay with us as we continue demystifying birth psychology. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for being part of this growing movement, because when we bring awareness to the beginning, we don't just gain insight, we begin to shift the foundations of humanity.